Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've built around Arabella, Abandoned Doll, from Duskmourn. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, but this won't include costs such as shipping. So, Arabella, Abandoned Doll, is a 1/3 legendary toy costing a red and a white mana to cast, and it has it so whenever Arabella attacks, it deals X damage to each opponent and you gain X life, with X being the number of creatures you control with power 2 or less, which I thought was actually a pretty solid ability for an uncommon. So broadly, this commander is suggesting the aggro Boros white weenies archetype, though wanting to avoid anthems and other power buffs for the most part, as we'll want to keep those powers no higher than 2, so that we drain our opponents as fast as possible. As such, a significant portion of this deck will be focused on low power creature token generation, while also having low powered non-token creatures with useful abilities slotted in wherever reasonable, trying to go as wide as possible, as quickly as possible. And since we'll be looking to attack with Arabella as often as possible, we'll also want to have a handful of spells either to make it difficult to block Arabella, or, in the case that an opponent does deal with her, ways to give Arabella, or other creatures, haste, so that we can swing right away again. But with that quick overview out of the way, let's get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. First up are some mana dorks with Gold Mirror and Iron Mirror, tapping for white and red mana, respectively, and Ornithopter of Paradise, tapping for any color we can need. While we also have Mannequin and Hedron Crawler for generic mana production. And then for mana rocks, there's Boros Signet, turning 1 mana into a white and a red mana, Talisman of Conviction, tapping for generic, or giving us a white or a red mana at the cost of pinging ourselves for 1, and Arcane Signet to tap for any color we can need at that time. But now with ramp out of the way, let's get into the meat of this deck with our creature token generation. I'll start with our non-permanent spells, with Rally at the Hornburg, making 2 1/1 human tokens and giving your humans haste for the turn, and Midnight Haunting, making 2 1/1 spirit tokens with flying. Hordling Outburst and Hop to It make 3 1/1 creature tokens, goblins and rabbits, respectively. And Midnight Mayhem makes 3 1/1 gremlin creature tokens, while also giving your gremlins menace, lifelink, and haste for the turn. While Glimpse the Impossible is a bit of a fun one for this deck, as it's basically an impulse draw spell, having you exile the top 3 cards of your library, though unlike most impulse, you can only play those cards that turn. But for those cards that remain in exile during your next end step, they go to your graveyard, and you make a 0/1 Eldrazi creature token for each of those cards. Then we have a bunch of X-cost creature token generation spells, starting with White Sun Zenith to make X 2/2 cat creature tokens, with White Sun Zenith getting shuffled into your library instead of going to your graveyard. Decree of Justice, which normally makes 4/4 Flying Angel tokens, but we'll actually want to cycle this card in this deck, as, when it's cycled, you can still pay X and then make X 1/1 Soldier creature tokens. Finale of Glory makes X 2/2 Soldier creature tokens with Vigilance, though it can also make 4/4 Angels if X is 10 or greater. Path of the Ghost Hunter makes X 1/1 Spirit creature tokens with flying. And finally, Secure the Waste and Song of Totentans makes X 1/1 Warriors and Rats, respectively, though those rats can't block, and Song of Totentans also gives your creatures haste for the turn. Now moving on to permanents that make creature tokens. Rabble Rousing makes it so whenever you attack with 1 or more creatures, you make that many 1/1 white-green citizen creature tokens, while the spell also has Hideaway 5 where, as it's entering the battlefield, it lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library and exile one of those face down to play later without paying its mana cost, which in this case requires you to control 10 or more creatures after making those citizen tokens, with the other 4 cards going to the bottom of your library in a random order. Then Sky Knight Vanguard is a 1/2 with flying that makes a tapped and attacking 1/1 soldier creature token whenever it attacks. Loyal Apprentice and Siege Gang Lieutenant make creature tokens at the start of your combat phase, provided you control your commander, with the former making a 1/1 Thopter with flying, and the latter making 2 1/1 goblins, with both of these creatures giving their generated tokens haste for the turn. And finally for this chapter, an Impakal, Thousandth Moon, is a 1/2 that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you attack with 1 or more non-gnome creatures, and then makes X 1/1 gnome creature tokens, with X being the number of +1/+1 counters on an Impakal. But now let's go over some of our haste givers and ways to give Arabella some evasion. Starting with haste, Gorogoro, Disciple of Ryusei, can simply have 1 red paid into it to give your creatures haste for the turn. Crashing Drawbridge can be tapped to give your creatures haste for the turn. Thopter Engineer technically could have been in the previous chapter, as it makes a 1/1 flying Thopter token when it enters the battlefield, but it also gives our artifact creatures haste, which does include our commander. And Tuk Tuk Rebel Fort is a wall with defender and reach that always just gives your creatures haste. And then for a bit of evasion, Sabira, Telzidi Caravaner, and Ragged Playmate have activated abilities to make a target creature with power 2 or less unblockable for the turn, while Trailblazer's Boots will give its equipped creature non-basic land walk, which, while not guaranteed, it's pretty unlikely that you'll play in a pod where everyone only has basics on the field. But now I'd like to go over the cards that have significant potential to be game-ending, or at least shorten how many turns will be left until endgame. First up are some ETB pinging effects with Impact Tremors, Molten Gatekeeper, and Witty Roastmaster, each having it so whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, said permanent deals 1 damage to each opponent, which can definitely add up as we keep making those creature tokens. Gratuitous Violence makes it so our creatures deal double the damage they normally would have to a player or permanent, so less weenies are needed to deal a massive amount of damage with Arabella. And Isengard Unleashed makes it so damage can't be prevented that turn, and makes it so your sources deal triple damage the turn it's cast. So there's a pretty decent chance that when you're looking to cast this, if it resolves, you're probably dealing lethal to at least somebody through Arabella, though this spell also has flashback in case you need a second chance. Then we have a few token generators that can make an absurd number of tokens, with Visions of Glory likely being the weakest among them, making a 1/1 human creature token for each creature you control, though it also has flashback. Call of the Coppercoats has you choose any number of opponents, with the total cost to cast that spell depending on how many you choose, but then you make X 1/1 human soldier creature tokens, with X being the number of creatures those opponents control. And Stormherd will effectively be game if you can get this to resolve before combat on your turn, and if you have the highest life total on the field, as it makes X 1/1 Flying Pegasus tokens, with X being your life total. And finally for this section, Grafted Exoskeleton gives its equipped creature +2/+2 and Infect, so while it would give Arabella a power above 2, there's a decent chance you'll have enough other weenies on the field by the time you're casting and equipping this to ensure lethal damage through poison counters. But with that, let's go over our interaction spells. Starting off pretty standard with Swords to Plowshares and Path to exile a target creature for 1 white, though that creature's controller gets life equal to its power or basic land for their creature, respectively. While Exercise exiles a target artifact, enchantment, or creature with power 4 or greater, which is handy given Arabella has 3 toughness, though this does only work at sorcery speed. Then Stroke of Midnight destroys a target non-land permanent, with that permanent's owner getting a 1/1 human token, and Lightning Helix deals 3 damage to any target and gives you 3 life. Then Shunt and Untimely Malfunction can be used to redirect a spell away from our stuff, as it lets us change the target of a target spell with a single target. Though, Untimely Malfunction can alternatively be used to destroy a target artifact, or make 1 or 2 creatures unable to block for the turn. Then Selfless Spirit is here as a bit of board wipe insurance, as it's a 2/1 flyer that we can sack to give creatures we control indestructible for the turn. And speaking on board wipes, we have Dusk Dawn and Fell the Mighty, the former with Dusk, destroying all creatures with power 3 or greater, and the latter destroying all creatures with power greater than a target creature's power, so these are wipes that shouldn't really affect our board state much. But with that, let's start going over our card advantage spells. I'll start with Impulse before moving on to straight up draw, with Reckless Impulse and Light Up the Stage exiling the top 2 cards of your library, which you can play until the end of your next turn, with the latter also having a spectacle cost of 1 red if an opponent lost life that turn. And then March of Reckless Joy and Commune with Lava exile X cards from the top of your library, which you can play until your next turn, though the former only lets you play 2 of them, and is likely one of the first cards I'd look to upgrade away from. Outpost Siege has you exile the top card of your library at the start of your upkeep, which you can play that turn, provided you chose Khans as that enchantment enters the battlefield. And Nayali, Sun's Vanguard, gives your attacking tokens double strike, and has you exile the top card of your library whenever you attack with 1 or more tokens, of which you can play that exiled card during any turn that you've attacked with a token. Then moving to straight draw, Mary, Esquire of Rohan, is a 2/2 with haste that has you draw whenever you attack with Mary and another legendary creature, though keeping Mary alive across turns would be the challenge with this card. Idol of Oblivion can simply be tapped to draw, provided you created a token that turn. And Dawn of Hope lets you pay 2 whenever you gain life to draw a card, while also being a, frankly, mana expensive source of 1/1 creature tokens. Mentor of the Meek lets you draw 1 whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control to draw a card. And Welcoming Vampire has you draw whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, though only once per turn. And Rumor Gatherer has an ability that triggers whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, with the first trigger per turn having you scry 1, the second trigger per turn having you draw 1, and then any subsequent triggers go back to scrying 1. And then finally, Cosmos Elixir has you draw a card at the beginning of your end step if your life total is higher than your starting life total, or otherwise, you gain 2 life. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's go over our land base. First up are some land tutor lands with Promising Vein and Shire Terrace, tapping for generic, or they can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. And Myriad Landscape can be sacked to tutor 2 basic lands of the same type onto the battlefield tapped. Then moving on to our Boros dual lands, we have Sunscorched Divide, converting 1 mana into a red and a white mana, Clifftop Retreat, Fury Calm Snarl, and Raucous Carnival, being Boros tap lands with ways for them to enter the battlefield untapped. And Command Tower will tap for any color we need while entering the battlefield untapped. Then for guaranteed to be tapped duels, we have Temple of Triumph as a scry land, Windscarred Crag as a life gain land, Abraded Bluffs, which pings an opponent for 1 when it enters the battlefield, and Boros Garrison as a bounce land. Path of Ancestry will also tap for any color we could need at the time, but if we cast a toy creature with it, we get to scry 1. And then for a little bit of utility, we have Cur Keep, Flamekin Village, and Rogue's Passage. Cur Keep being able to make 0/1 creature tokens, Flamekin Village being able to give a creature haste for the turn, and Rogue's Passage being able to make a creature unblockable for the turn. And finally, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 10 basic plains and 9 basic mountains. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing for just a bit under $45 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but doesn't include costs such as shipping. And before closing out this video, I'd like to quickly run through some more expensive cards that you may wish to consider if building this deck with a slightly higher budget. First up, Delny, Streetwise Lookout, would make swinging with Arabella much less risky, as creatures with power 3 or greater couldn't block her while making her ability trigger a second time whenever it does trigger. A Gate Instigator gets you 2 1-power bodies on the field if its offspring cost was also paid, with both of those pinging each opponent for 1 whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control. Enduring Innocence is another source of draw, having you draw whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, but only once per turn, while at first being a 2/1 creature that is returned as a non-creature enchantment if it dies. Jackrabbit is a 1/2 at base, but it can have mana paid into its X to give it additional +1/+1 counters on it, and whenever it attacks, you make as many 1/1 rabbit creature tokens as Jackrabbit's power, so while it itself likely won't be used to drain our opponents through Arabella, it could potentially make a bunch of tokens that do. And finally, for more or better protection for our board state, Grand Crescendo acts as both a source of creature tokens, making X 1/1 citizen creature tokens, but it's also protection as it gives your creatures indestructible for the turn, which, along those lines, I should also mention Flawless Maneuver, which also gives your creatures indestructible, and Guardian of Faith, which lets you phase out any number of creatures you control to, say, avoid a board wipe, but you don't actually lose your tokens since they aren't really leaving the battlefield. But with that, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and maybe drop a sub if you'd like more budget commander decks in your feeds. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.